Louisville, Kentucky, 1960. The air was thick with tension as Cassius Clay, not yet known to the world as Muhammad Ali, stepped out of the taxi. At 28 years old, he had already made history by winning Olympic gold in Rome. But here, in his hometown, he was still just another black man, expected to know his place. The restaurant before him, gleaming white under the afternoon sun, was one of the most prestigious in the city, a place where deals were made, where the wealthy and powerful gathered, a place where someone like him was only welcome if he came to serve, not to be served. "Remember what I told you," his manager whispered, tugging nervously at his collar. "Just use the back entrance. It'll avoid any complications." What his manager didn't understand was that Cassius Clay was not a man who avoided complications. In fact, he seemed to seek them out with the same precision and determination he showed in the ring. The young boxer straightened his tie, his eyes fixed on the ornate front doors of the establishment. If this story has already made you feel something, no matter how small, don't leave without giving back. Comment and tell me where you're watching this video from, and subscribe to the channel. "I appreciate your concern," Clay said, his voice steady and clear, "but I didn't win gold for America to be told to use the back door." His words weren't spoken with anger, but with a quiet conviction that made them all the more powerful. "I'm going through the front, like any other champion would." The sidewalk seemed to stretch endlessly before him as he took his first steps toward the entrance. Each footfall echoed with purpose. He could feel eyes on him, from the street, from passing cars, from within the restaurant itself, where patrons peered curiously through the windows. Some faces showed contempt, others fear. A few showed something that might have been respect. But Clay didn't fight for their respect. He fought for something much bigger, dignity. As he reached for the door handle, a white staff member appeared, blocking his path. "Sir," the man said, the word dripping with forced politeness, "I believe you've been informed that individuals of your background are required to use the service entrance." The man gestured vaguely toward the alley that ran alongside the building, where the garbage was collected and deliveries were made. Clay's eyes met the man's, unwavering. "My name is Cassius Clay," he said, his voice rising just enough to be heard by those inside. "Olympic gold medalist. I represent the United States of America, and I'll be using this door right here." The confidence in his voice wasn't bravado. It was the same steady certainty that had carried him through 18 professional fights without a single defeat. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The staff member glanced nervously toward his manager, who stood frozen on the sidewalk. Inside, conversations had fallen silent. The entire restaurant waited to see what would happen next, as if the very fabric of their society hung in the balance of this one small confrontation. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as Cassius Clay stood face to face with the restaurant employee. Neither man moved. The air between them crackled with unspoken history, centuries of oppression, of rules written and unwritten, of boundaries drawn and enforced with violence when necessary. But in that moment, it was the young boxer who appeared unmovable, as if the very earth beneath his feet had decided to claim him as its anchor. "I don't want trouble," the employee finally said, his voice lower now, almost conspiratorial. "But we have rules here." "So do I," Clay responded, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And my rule is that I walk through the front door of any establishment I'm invited to. Now, am I invited? Or should I take my business elsewhere?" Around them, a small crowd had begun to gather. Some were mere onlookers, curious about the commotion, but others recognized the young boxer. Whispers of "That's Clay" and "the Olympic champion" rippled through the growing audience. This was no longer a private disagreement. It was becoming a public demonstration of the very inequality that simmered beneath the surface of American society. Inside the restaurant, the manager had appeared, his face flushed with the uncomfortable realization that this situation could quickly escalate beyond his control. The last thing he needed was a scene involving one of Louisville's most famous young athletes, regardless of his color. With visible reluctance, he nodded to his employee, who stepped aside, opening the door with a stiff gesture. Clay didn't rush. He stepped through the doorway with deliberate slowness, acknowledging the significance of the moment. This wasn't just about him getting a meal, it was about challenging a system designed to humiliate and diminish. Every eye in the restaurant was on him as he followed the host to a table. Some patrons looked away in discomfort, others stared openly with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. As he sat down, smoothing his napkin across his lap with the same care he wrapped his hands before a fight, Clay knew that this small act of defiance would ripple outward. Word would spread. Questions would be asked. Why could an Olympic champion not use the front door? What did that say about America, about freedom, about the medals and accolades bestowed upon black athletes who were celebrated in the ring but segregated on the street? The meal itself was unremarkable: steak, potatoes, vegetables arranged with careful precision. But the act of sitting there, of being served like any other patron, of refusing to accept less than his full humanity, that was revolutionary. And Cassius Clay knew, as he ate each bite with deliberate enjoyment, that he was fighting not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been told to use the back door, to step aside, to make themselves smaller for someone else's comfort. The news spread like wildfire through Louisville and beyond. By morning, Cassius Clay's act of defiance had become both a rallying cry and a source of outrage, depending on who was telling the story. Some newspapers mentioned it briefly. A small note in the sports section: Clay makes scene at downtown restaurant. Others, particularly those serving the black community, gave it front-page treatment. Olympic champion refuses backdoor treatment. In his apartment, Clay sat surrounded by ringing telephones. His manager paced nervously, fielding calls from reporters, from potential sponsors suddenly reconsidering their interest, from fight promoters concerned about backing a troublemaker. The young boxer remained calm, listening to the chaos swirling around him with a detached interest that belied the significance of what was happening. "You should issue a statement," his manager insisted, covering the mouthpiece of one phone while another jangled insistently. "Say it was a misunderstanding, that you meant no disrespect to the establishment's policies." Clay looked up, his eyes clear and focused. "But I did mean disrespect," he said simply. "Those policies deserve disrespect. They're disrespectful to me, to my parents, to everyone who looks like us." He stood, stretching as if preparing for a training session rather than what might be the biggest public relations crisis of his young career. "But I won't apologize for walking through a door." Later that afternoon, he received a visitor, an older black man who introduced himself as a civil rights organizer. "What you did," the man said, settling into a chair across from Clay, "it might seem small to some, just a door, just a meal, but these small dignities, they're what we're fighting for. The right to move through the world with the same respect as anyone else." Clay nodded, understanding blooming across his face. Until now, his fights had been confined to the ring, his victories measured in knockouts and judges' decisions. But this was different. This was about something bigger than sports, bigger than personal achievement. This was about challenging the very foundations upon which American society had been built. "I didn't plan it," he admitted. "I just couldn't make myself walk around to that back door. Not after standing on that Olympic podium, hearing the national anthem representing this country." Sometimes the most powerful statements are the ones we make when we simply refuse to accept injustice as normal, the older man replied. "You've given people something to talk about, to think about." And that's how change begins. As the visitor left, Clay stood at his window, looking out at the city that had shaped him. He knew there would be consequences. Doors that had been opening might now close. People who had cheered for him might now turn away. But he felt a new kind of strength growing within him, not the physical power that had made him a champion, but a moral certainty that would soon transform him into something more, a symbol. 3 years later, the world knew him as Muhammad Ali. He had shed not just his slave name, as he called it, but also the constraints of being merely an athlete. As he prepared for his historic fight against Sonny Liston, he understood that his battle extended far beyond the ropes of the boxing ring. The young man who had refused to use the back entrance had become a voice for those still forced through society's back doors, a champion in the truest sense of the word. "And I don't have to be what you want me to be," he told reporters at a pre-fight press conference, the words flowing with a poet's rhythm and a prophet's conviction. "I'm free to be who I want." That freedom had come at a cost. Sponsors had withdrawn. Critics had multiplied. The boxing establishment regarded him with suspicion bordering on hostility. But for every door that closed, others had opened. He had found his voice, not just as an athlete, but as an advocate, a leader, a man willing to stand by his principles regardless of the personal sacrifice. In locker rooms and training camps across America, young black athletes watched Ali with wonder and growing determination. If he could refuse the back door, perhaps they too could challenge the limitations imposed upon them. In neighborhoods and communities segregated by law and custom, his example offered a glimpse of what might be possible when one simply refused to accept the unacceptable. The night before the Liston fight, Ali lay awake, thinking back to that moment in Louisville, how different his life might have been if he had simply followed instructions, walked around to the back, accepted his designated place. It would have been easier, certainly, more comfortable. But something in him had known, even then, that true greatness never comes from taking the easy path. When he stepped into the ring the next night, he carried with him not just the hopes of those who had bet on his unlikely victory, but the dreams of countless individuals who saw in him a different kind of possibility, a future where dignity was not determined by the color of one's skin, but by the content of one's character and the courage of one's convictions. "May float like a butterfly, sting like a bee," he had famously proclaimed, but his true legacy would not be measured in catchphrases or even championship belts. It would be found in the doors, literal and figurative, that opened because one young man refused to accept anything less than the full measure of respect he deserved. Decades later, long after his boxing career had ended, Muhammad Ali would return to that same restaurant in Louisville. This time they held the front door open for him. This time they named a dish in his honor. This time they treated him as the legend he had become. But Ali never forgot what it had felt like to stand before that door, knowing that his next step would either reinforce the status quo or challenge it forever. "Sometimes," he told a young admirer who asked about that long-ago day, "the most important fights happen outside the ring. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't winning, it's refusing to lose your dignity, no matter what the odds." The restaurant that had once tried to send him to the back now proudly displayed his photograph near the entrance, a reminder that history is made not just by those who wield power, but by those who have the courage to challenge it. The young man who had simply wanted to be treated like any other champion had become something far greater, a symbol of the ongoing struggle for equality, for justice, for the simple human dignity of walking through the front door. If you've made it this far and felt every word, don't leave without subscribing. I tell these stories with my heart in my hands to reach people like you, who feel, who get emotional, who live. If this truly touched you, give back. Comment, subscribe, come be part of this family with me until the next video.